I've heard enough. Next, said Preston Calloway, not even looking up from his phone, and the room of 200 people laughed the particular laugh that rooms full of powerful people laugh when someone rich has just been cruel and called it honesty. If you've ever had someone decide who you are before you finished a single sentence, you already know exactly how that laugh lands in your chest, and you'll want to stay for what happens next, because this story doesn't end where that laugh does. Before we go further, if stories like this one, about being underestimated and proven right anyway, speak to something in you, there are more of them waiting on this channel, and it's worth sticking around after this one to find them. But to understand why that room went quiet 30 seconds after it started laughing, you have to go back to an ordinary Wednesday in March, 6 weeks before demo day, when Daniel Osei's biggest problem was convincing his 6-year-old son that a robot named Watts did not, in fact, need his own seat at the dinner table. Daniel Osei woke most mornings at 5:15, which was earlier than he needed to, but which had become, over the 2 years since his wife Adiz died, less a matter of necessity and more a matter of not being able to lie still in the quiet of a house that still had her handwriting on the whiteboard in the kitchen. A grocery list from a Tuesday in October that he had never erased and told himself, every few months, that he would erase soon, and never did. He would lie there in the gray half-light for a minute or two, listening to the pipes settle, and then he'd get up and start the coffee and go wake Micah, who slept the deep, sprawling sleep of a child who had never once, in his 6 years on Earth, had a reason to doubt that the world would still be there when he opened his eyes. Micah kept a small toy robot on his nightstand every night, a battered plastic thing about the size of a soda can with a scuffed blue chest plate, and one eye that no longer lit up because the battery contact had corroded a year earlier, and Daniel hadn't yet found the right size replacement battery. A fact Micah had decided, with the airtight logic of a 6-year-old, meant the robot was resting his eye, not broken. The robot's name was Watts, chosen because Micah had heard his father use the word once while muttering about a power supply and had liked the sound of it, and Watts went everywhere: school, the grocery store, church on the Sundays they went, propped on the edge of the bathtub during bath time in case, as Micah explained with total seriousness, he gets bored waiting. Daniel had learned, the hard way, on a Tuesday morning 8 months earlier when Watts had been left behind at a gas station 2 hours from home, that a forgotten toy robot could produce a level of grief in a 6-year-old that made grown men in gas station parking lots stop and ask if everything was okay. They had driven back for him. Of course they had. What almost nobody in Daniel's current life knew, not the parents at Micah's school, not the barista at the coffee shop where Daniel worked most mornings, because his apartment's internet kept dropping, not even most of the people he'd start pitching to in the coming weeks, was that Daniel Osei had spent 9 years as a senior robotics engineer at a firm in Waltham, Massachusetts, that built advanced prosthetic and mobility devices for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and that his name sat quietly on 4 patents related to adaptive grip sensors, technology that, at that point, had already been fitted onto the hands of more than 3,000 amputees across the country, none of whom had any reason to know the engineer's name behind the wrist that let them hold a coffee cup again, or a fork, or their own child's hand. He had left that job 2 years and 3 months earlier, 6 weeks after Adiz's death, not out of grief alone, though grief had been most of it, but because somewhere in the wreckage of that year he had become obsessed, in the specific and consuming way that only certain kinds of lost produce, with a piece of technology that did not yet exist and that he could not stop thinking about. A low-cost, modular home mobility and fall detection system built for elderly and disabled people living alone, priced for the people who actually needed it rather than the people who could most easily afford it. Because Adiz had died of complications from a fall in their own kitchen, at 34 years old, from a heart condition nobody had caught in time, and the ambulance had taken 11 minutes to arrive because nobody had known to call it for the first 6 of those minutes. Because there had been nothing in that kitchen designed to know before Daniel walked in and found her. He didn't talk about any of this. Not because he was hiding some tortured secret exactly, but because grief, in his experience, made people's faces do a particular thing, a softening. A leaning in, a hand reaching toward his arm that he had decided, somewhere in that first terrible year, he simply could not carry alongside everything else he was already carrying. So he kept it small. He told people when they asked what he did that he was working on a startup, a health tech thing, and let the sentence end there, and most people, being polite, let it end there too. The company he had built alone in the 2 years since was called Anchor Home Systems, and it consisted, as of that Wednesday in March, of Daniel, a working hardware prototype he had assembled himself out of sensors he'd sourced from 3 different suppliers and soldered together on his kitchen table after Micah went to bed, a patent filing he'd paid for out of what remained of his and Adie's savings, and a growing folder of emails from pilot users. 6 elderly participants recruited through a senior center 2 towns over, plus more recently, a small assisted living facility that had agreed to a 3-month trial after its administrator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Feinberg, had watched the system detect a resident's fall in real time during a demo and had said flatly, "How fast can you get me 20 more of these?" What Daniel did not have was money. He had burned through nearly all of his and Adie's savings on the patent filing, the prototype components, and 18 months of rent while working nights and weekends. And he had reached, by that Wednesday in March, the specific kind of financial edge where the next 30 to 60 days would determine whether Anchor Home Systems became something real or became one more good idea that died quietly in a garage, because nobody with money had been willing to look at it long enough to understand what it was. Which was why, that Wednesday morning between making Micah's oatmeal, Micah insisted it be the lumpy kind, not the smooth kind, a distinction Daniel had learned to honor without argument, and driving him to school, Daniel had got the email that mattered more than any email he'd received in 2 years. An invitation to pitch at Meridian Founders Weekend, a regional demo day that, while not among the largest in the country, was known for reliably attracting at least 2 or 3 investors capable of writing a seed check large enough to change everything for a company like his. He had applied on a whim 4 months earlier, one of nearly 300 applicants, and had genuinely forgotten about it until the acceptance email arrived. Subject line, "You're in Meridian Founders Weekend, March." And he had sat in the school drop-off line with the engine idling and read it twice before he trusted it was real. "Dad," Micah said from the back seat, watching his father's face in the rearview mirror with the particular attentiveness small children develop toward their parents' moods, "are you happy or are you gonna cry happy?" "I might do both, bud," Daniel said, laughing despite himself, and Micah considered this with total seriousness. "Watts says that's allowed," Micah announced, holding the robot up so it could, apparently, confirm this from the back seat. "He says crying happy is a real thing." "Watts is a wise man," Daniel said, and pulled up to the curb, and Micah scrambled out with his backpack and Watts tucked under one arm, and turned around at the school door, the way he always did, to wave. And Daniel waved back and sat there a moment longer than he needed to, the way he always did, watching the door close behind his son before he pulled away. He drove to the coffee shop on Kessler Street with the radio off, the way he usually preferred when he needed to think, and ordered his usual, a plain drip coffee, no room for cream, because he'd stopped adding cream around the same time he'd stopped doing most of the small, easy comforts a person does without thinking when there's someone else in the house to notice whether they're taking care of themselves, and sat at the corner table by the outlet, the one the regulars all silently understood was his, and opened his laptop, and just stared at the acceptance email for a long moment before he could make himself do anything else. He called his mother, Comfort Osei, 71 years old, living in a two-bedroom apartment 40 minutes outside the city on a fixed income from 31 years as a hospital dietary aide, right there at the corner table, phone pressed to his ear, coffee going lukewarm in front of him. "Ma," he said when she picked up, her voice warm and a little rushed the way it always was in the mornings, "I got into the demo day. Meridian. The big one I told you about." There was a pause on the line, and then a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The sound his mother made when she was trying not to cry in public. Because she was, he knew without needing to see her, standing in her own kitchen at that exact moment, and he could picture the kitchen exactly, the yellow W curtains, the calendar from the church still turned to the wrong month, the chair by the window where she liked to sit with her tea in the evenings, because it was, in fact, precisely the kind of kitchen he had spent 2 years designing his entire company around. The kind of kitchen where a fall might happen to a woman living alone and nobody would know for 11 minutes, or 20, or longer. "Daniel," she said, "you tell me the date. I want it written down. I want to be praying that whole day from the morning until you tell me it's done." "I will, Ma." "And you'll wear the good blazer, the gray one." "I'll wear the good blazer." "Good," she said, and then, more quietly, in the tone she reserved for the parts of these conversations that both of them tended to walk around carefully, "Adiz would be so proud of you, baby. You know that." "I know, Ma," Daniel said, and had to look hard at the corner of the coffee shop ceiling for a moment before he trusted his voice again. "I know." The 6 weeks between that email and Meridian Founders Weekend were the most concentrated 6 weeks of work Daniel had done since he'd left Waltham. He refined the pitch deck at the kitchen table after Micah's bedtime, night after night, the blue glow of the laptop screen the only light in the apartment. Adi's grocery list still on the whiteboard in his peripheral vision the whole time. A grocery list he had, at some point without quite deciding to, started treating less like a wound and more like a witness proof that this had once been a house with two people planning a future in it, and that the future he was building now, alone in the quiet, was still in some way a continuation of that. He practiced the pitch in the bathroom mirror while brushing his teeth. He practiced it in the car at red lights. He practiced it once embarrassingly in front of Micah, who listened with his arms crossed and his robot propped on the couch beside him like a small, silent board member, and who, at the end, said, "You said 4 times. Watts counted." "Watts counted," Daniel repeated, laughing. "He's very serious about it," Micah said. He cut the s down to 2. Those 6 weeks were not easy ones underneath the surface of the work. Money was tighter than Daniel let himself dwell on for too long at a stretch. The patent filing had eaten more of the savings than he'd planned for, and there had been a stretch in early February where he'd quietly stopped buying the name brand version of Micah's favorite cereal and started buying the store brand instead, watching carefully to see if Micah noticed. And Micah, mercifully, either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared, which was its own small, complicated relief. Daniel picked up 2 freelance consulting contracts during those weeks, reviewing prosthetic component designs for a firm in Chicago over video calls late at night after Micah was asleep. Work that paid enough to cover rent and kept him up past midnight more nights than he wanted to admit, so that some mornings, waking at 5:15, felt less like a habit and more like a debt he owed his own son, the debt of being awake and present and unhurried for him, no matter how little sleep the night had actually offered. He kept a small spiral notebook on the kitchen counter those weeks, the kind you could buy for $1 at the drugstore, and in it he wrote, most nights before bed, a single sentence about why he was doing any of this, not because he needed reminding exactly, but because writing it down in his own handwriting made it feel less like something happening to him and more like something he was choosing, on purpose again, every day. Some nights the sentence was practical. Pricing needs to hit under $400 per unit or Carol can't scale it past the pilot. Some nights it was something closer to a prayer. One night, after a video call with Chicago had run long and he'd gone to check on Micah before finally going to bed himself, and found his son asleep with Watts fallen halfway off the mattress, one small hand still reaching for it even in sleep. Daniel had written, simply, "This is for both of you," and left it at that. There was a Sunday, 3 weeks before the pitch, when he took Micah out to the senior center where his 6 original pilot participants lived, because Micah had asked, more than once, what the helper robot actually did, and Daniel had decided that showing him mattered more than explaining it. They met Mrs. Odelise Ferreira, 83, who had been the very first person to agree to let Daniel install a unit in her small apartment, back when the whole system was still held together with what Daniel privately called hope and electrical tape. And Mrs. Ferreira, delighted to have a visitor under the age of 60, let Micah press the test button on the sensor unit mounted discreetly near her kitchen doorway, and explain to him, in her slow, careful English, her second language, that before Daniel's little box went up on her wall, her daughter used to call her 3 times a day just to make sure she hadn't fallen, and now her daughter called once in the evening, just to talk like a normal family, not like a nurse checking on a patient. And Micah had listened to this with an expression of real, serious concentration, the same expression he brought to complicated cartoons, and on the drive home had said, "Dad, your robot thing isn't really about robots. It's about people not being scared for each other so much." Daniel had nearly had to pull the car over. "Where'd you get that from, Bud?" "I don't know," Micah said, already losing interest, reaching for Watts on the seat beside him. "It's just what it seemed like." Daniel drove the rest of the way home in a kind of quiet, humbled silence, turning that sentence over and over, thinking that if he never managed to say it better than his 7-year-old just had, he would still consider the company a success. By the week of the pitch itself, the deck had gone through 11 full revisions. Daniel had timed himself with a stopwatch app so many times that he'd started dreaming, some nights, in 11-minute intervals, waking abruptly at what felt like exactly the right moment without needing to check the clock. He'd ironed the gray blazer twice, though it hadn't needed it either time, simply because doing something with his hands the night before felt better than sitting with the nervous, coiled feeling in his stomach that had started showing up around dinner time and not fully leaving until he fell asleep. The night before the demo day, he laid out his one good blazer, the same one he'd worn to Adee's funeral, which he'd debated for a long time before deciding to wear anyway, because it was the only blazer he owned that fit properly, and because some part of him, the part that still talked to her sometimes quietly in the kitchen, when Micah was asleep, wanted her there in whatever small way an old blazer could manage. He packed the working prototype into a padded case. He wrote out, on an index card, 3 sentences he wanted to make sure landed no matter what else went wrong. What the system did, who it was for, and why the price point mattered more than the technology itself, because the technology, on its own, wasn't the innovation. The innovation was making it something a retired bus driver on a fixed income could actually afford, instead of something that only existed for people who already had enough resources that a fall in the kitchen was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. The night before the pitch, Daniel had arranged for Micah to stay with the family 2 doors down, the Whitfields, whose own son Marcus, a coincidence of naming Daniel found faintly amusing every time he thought about it, was Micah's closest friend from school, and dropping Micah off that evening, watching him run inside already deep in conversation about some elaborate backyard game the 2 boys had apparently been planning all week, Daniel had felt the particular, complicated loneliness of a single parent standing on someone else's porch, grateful and slightly hollowed out at once, before Mrs. Whitfield, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Dara who had watched Micah more times than Daniel could easily count without ever once making him feel like he owed her more than a thank you, had put a hand on his arm and said, "Go get some sleep, Daniel. You've got a big day. He'll be here laughing so hard he won't even miss you." And Daniel had laughed and thanked her and driven home to an apartment that felt, that one night, unusually quiet, and had lain awake far longer than he wanted to, running the numbers in his head one more time, the pilot data, the manufacturing costs, Carol Feinberg's letter, before finally drifting into a thin, restless sleep just past 1 in the morning. He woke before his alarm, the way he always did before something that mattered, and dressed in the gray blazer in the dim early light, and stood for a moment in front of the bathroom mirror doing one last silent run of the opening line, the way he had done every morning for 6 weeks. And then he drove downtown with the prototype case belted into the passenger seat like a second passenger, radio off again, coffee in the cup holder going cold, because his stomach wouldn't allow more than 2 sips of it. Meridian Founders Weekend was held in a renovated warehouse space downtown, exposed brick and string lights, and a stage with a countdown clock, the kind of environment engineered to feel casually important. And walking in that first morning, Daniel felt smaller than he wanted to admit, surrounded by founders in expensive sneakers and clean, confident jargon, teams of 3 and 4 standing in tight, easy clusters comparing notes. While he stood alone near the registration table with a padded case and an index card in his blazer pocket, and for one unsteady moment he thought, clearly and without drama, I don't belong in this room, before he caught himself, the way he had learned to catch himself over 2 years of doing this mostly alone, and thought instead of Mrs. Ferrera's kitchen, and Carol Feinberg's letter, and a whiteboard grocery list he had never erased, and straightened his shoulders, and found his assigned booth number. And it was, on the second day, in the main pitch room in front of roughly 200 attendees, other founders, a scattering of press, and seated in the reserved front section with the particular loose-limbed posture of men who have never once worried about being interrupted, 6 investors whose names carried real weight in the regional funding scene, that Daniel walked up to the small stage carrying his prototype case, his index card folded in his blazer pocket, though he'd long since memorized it, and began. My name is Daniel Osei, and 2 years ago I lost my wife to a fall in our own kitchen that a smart home system, if we'd had one, would have caught in under 30 seconds instead of the 11 minutes it actually took us to get help, he said. And the room, which had been shuffling and half-listening through the first 2 pitches of the morning, went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a sentence lands somewhere true. I built Anchor Home Systems because the fall detection technology that exists today is priced for people who don't need it as badly as the people who do. I spent 9 years designing adaptive prosthetics for the VA. I know what good engineering looks like, and I know what it costs to make it good enough for someone like the woman who raised me, on a fixed income, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes outside the city. That's who I built this for. He had 11 minutes on the clock. He was 19 seconds into demonstrating the prototype, a compact wall-mounted sensor unit, no cameras, no invasive monitoring, just a discrete combination of motion and impact detection that could distinguish a hard fall from an ordinary sit-down with over 96% accuracy in his pilot data, at a manufacturing cost that would let it retail for under a third of the leading competitor's price. When Preston Calloway, seated in the front row in a gray quarter-zip that cost more than most people's monthly rent, glanced up from the phone he had been scrolling through since the pitch began, made a small, dismissive sound in his throat and said, loud enough to carry, "I've heard enough. Next." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The particular laugh of a room deciding, in real time, to side with power because siding with power is easier, and because Preston Calloway had funded 4 companies in that room over the years, and everyone knew it and everyone wanted, on some level, to be the kind of person he laughed with instead of the kind of person he laughed at. Daniel stood there for a second with the prototype still in his hands, the sensor's small indicator light blinking a soft, patient green, and felt something in his chest go very still. Not the hot, fast anger of a man about to lash out, but the colder, older kind of stillness that comes from having absorbed dismissal before and having learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how much of it he was willing to let touch him. I've got 10 more minutes on the clock, Daniel said, evenly, not raising his voice. You had 30 seconds with me, Preston said, already turning to say something to the investor beside him, not even bothering to look back up. Home safety devices are a saturated market and single-founder hardware plays with no technical co-founder don't scale. I'm not being unkind, I'm saving you the runway. Next. There was a particular quality to the word runway, thrown out so casually, so certain of its own authority, that made a few people in the room wince on Daniel's behalf. And it was in that wince, in that small ripple of second-hand embarrassment moving through the crowd, that Daniel made the decision that would define the next 10 minutes of his life, and though he didn't know it yet, the next several months of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue the market data, though he had it cold in his head ready. He did not mention the patents, or Waltham, or the 3,000 VA patients whose hands his sensors already lived inside. He looked at Preston Calloway for one long moment, the room watching, waiting to see which way this would break, and then he said quietly, "All right," and turned back to the small crowd of people who were still, in fact, watching him, and finished his pitch anyway. All 11 minutes of it calm, precise, unhurried, walking through the pilot data from the senior center, the letter from Carol Feinberg at the assisted living facility requesting 20 additional units, the unit economics. The manufacturing partner he'd already lined up in Ohio, speaking to the room as though the interruption had never happened, because he had to. Cited, somewhere in that cold, still second, that Preston Calloway's 30 seconds of judgment did not get to be the whole of his 11 minutes, and that walking off the stage in anger would have handed the man something Daniel had no intention of giving him: the satisfaction of having derailed him. When he finished, there was applause, real applause, not the polite kind, a few people even standing, and Daniel gathered the prototype back into its case and stepped down from the stage with his jaw tight in his hands. He noticed once he was off the platform and out of view, shaking slightly, the way hands sometimes shake after you've spent everything you have holding them steady in front of a room. Backstage, in the narrow hallway behind the pitch room where founders waited before and decompressed after, Daniel set the prototype case down against the wall and pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his closed eyes, not crying exactly, but close enough to it that he needed the wall behind him for a moment. He thought, unbidden, of a specific afternoon 8 years earlier in a conference room at the Waltham firm, when a senior director twice his age had dismissed an early design concept of his in a design review with a single wave of the hand. Not viable, next. Almost the identical cadence, almost the identical 2 words, and how he had gone back to his desk that day and quietly kept refining the concept anyway, on his own time. Until 11 months later, it became the adaptive grip sensor that ended up in 3,000 patients' hands, a patent with his own name on it, a technology that outlived the dismissal by nearly a decade and counting. He had learned, that day in Waltham, something he had needed to relearn today, standing against this brick wall, that other people's 30 seconds were never actually a verdict on the work. They were only ever a verdict on how much attention that particular person had been willing to spend. And attention, he reminded himself, breathing out slowly, was not the same thing as truth. It was a woman named Renata Osei, a fellow founder 2 pitches down the schedule that same morning, running a completely unrelated logistics startup, who found him in the hallway outside the main room a few minutes later, leaning against the brick wall with his eyes closed, and who didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him for a moment in a kind of solidarity that needed no explanation, before she said, "That was one of the best pitches I've heard today. For what it's worth." "Didn't feel like it up there," Daniel said. "Preston Calloway is famous for that," Renata said. "Ask anyone who's pitched at one of these in the last 5 years. He does it to at least one founder every single event. There's a whole informal club of people he's cut off." She paused. "There's also a rumor, I don't know if it's true, that he lost a big chunk of a fund on a hardware company that flamed out 2 years ago, and he's been gun-shy on anything with a physical product ever since. Doesn't make what he did to you okay. But it's not really about you. It never really is with guys like that. Doesn't make it feel any less personal, Daniel said. No, Renata agreed. It wouldn't. She didn't leave it there. Later that afternoon, over the lunch break, Renata found the event's lead organizer, a woman named Priyanka Desai who ran the whole Meridian Founders Weekend operation, and told her plainly what had happened and suggested, without being asked, that Daniel's pitch deserved a second look from someone who hadn't already made up their mind in the first 30 seconds. Priyanka, who took the reputation of her event seriously and who had, unbeknownst to most attendees, spent the morning quietly noting exactly which investors treated founders with respect and which didn't, walked over to a different investor during the lunch reception. A woman named Elena Vasquez, managing partner at a smaller but well-regarded fund called Coastline Ventures, known specifically for backing overlooked hardware founders, and said simply, "There's someone here you should talk to before the day ends. Booth 11, trust me on this one." Elena Vasquez found Daniel at his booth an hour later, a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a notepad she clearly still preferred over any app, examining the prototype case as though it might tell her something the pitch hadn't. "I heard what Calloway did," she said without preamble. "I also heard the rest of your pitch because I was standing at the back and I stayed. Most of the room left when he cut you off, or at least stopped listening. I noticed you didn't stop talking anyway. That told me something before you even got to the numbers." She picked up the prototype unit, turned it over once in her hands with the careful attention of someone who had clearly looked at a great many devices before and had learned to distinguish genuine engineering from a good story. Wrapped around a weak one. "Walk me through your unit economics again, slowly this time. I want the real numbers, not the 30-second version." Daniel walked her through it. All of it. The manufacturing cost breakdown, the pilot data, Carol Feinberg's letter, the patent portfolio he'd finally mentioned once someone was actually listening, the 9 years in Waltham that he still, even now, spoke about with a kind of careful understatement, as though bragging about it might somehow cheapen the reason he'd left. Elena listened for nearly 40 minutes, asked sharper questions than Preston Calloway had asked in his 30 seconds combined, and at the end of it said, "I want to do a full diligence call this week. If your pilot data holds up the way you're describing it, I think we can move fast on a term sheet. How fast do you need this to happen?" "Faster than is probably reasonable to ask," Daniel admitted. "Then let's not waste time being reasonable," Elena said. It was, in fact, faster than either of them had initially expected. Elena's diligence call happened 2 days later. Carol Feinberg, contacted directly by Elena's associate, spent 20 minutes on the phone describing, in specific and enthusiastic detail, the moment she'd watched the system catch a resident's fall in real time, and said, near the end of the call, unprompted, "I've had 6 device reps come through this building in 3 years trying to sell me things that don't work half as well and cost triple. Fund this man." The patent filings checked out. The manufacturing partner in Ohio confirmed pricing and timeline. And on the following Thursday, a little more than 24 hours as it happened, after Preston Calloway had cut Daniel off at 30 seconds in front of 200 people, Elena Vasquez called Daniel personally to tell him Coastline Ventures wanted to lead a $2 million seed round. Daniel was standing in his kitchen when the call came, Micah's homework spread across the table beside a bowl of the lumpy oatmeal reheated for an after-school snack. And when Elena said the number, he had to ask her to repeat it, and then he had to sit down. And Micah, watching his father's face do something complicated and overwhelmed, set down his crayon and said, with real concern, "Dad, are you happy crying again?" "Yeah, bud," Daniel said, laughing and wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Yeah, I think I am." The morning after the term sheet call, Daniel drove out to the assisted living facility to tell Carol Feinberg in person, because some news, he decided somewhere on the drive, deserved to be delivered face-to-face rather than by email. He found her in her cramped office off the main lobby, surrounded by binders and a space heater that rattled faintly against the tile floor. And when he told her the round had closed, that her 20 units were coming, that the pilot program that had started with her willingness to trust an unproven engineer with a homemade prototype was about to become something real and scaled, Carol had set down the folder she was holding, come around the desk, and hugged him, a brief, fierce, unsentimental hug from a woman who did not, by her own frequent admission, hug easily, and said, "I knew it the first week. I knew it when that thing caught Mr. Aldana's fall before the aide even turned the corner. I've been telling everyone who'd listen." She'd walked him down the hallway afterward, past the residents' rooms, several of whom knew him by now, an elderly man named Frank Aldana himself calling out, "There's my favorite engineer," from his doorway. And Daniel had stood in that hallway for a long moment, quietly overwhelmed by the specific, uncelebrated weight of being trusted by people who had every reason, given how many companies came through selling half-built promises, not to trust him at all. News of what had happened at Meridian Founders Weekend traveled the way these things travel in a tight regional startup scene, slowly at first, through a few direct messages and one detailed post from Renata Akoi on a founders forum describing what she'd witnessed. And then faster, once a local tech reporter named Wallace Tran, who covered the regional funding beat for a business publication, picked up the story and reached out to Daniel for comment. Daniel, true to form, kept his own quotes measured and factual. He talked about the mission of Anchor Home Systems, about Adiz, about the pilot data, and declined, more than once, to say anything sharply critical of Preston Calloway by name, saying only when pressed, "Investors turn down pitches every day for real reasons. That's part of the business. I don't think what happened to me was really about the pitch." But Wallace Tran had done his homework, had talked to 4 other founders willing to go on record about similar treatment from Calloway over the years, had gotten a comment from Priyanka Desai about the event's efforts to ensure NV store conduct reflects the values we want our founder community to experience, and had gotten, crucially, a comment from Elena Vasquez, who did not hold back at all. "I watched a man's technology save someone's grandmother from a completely preventable death, presented by an engineer with 4 patents and 9 years at one of the most respected prosthetics firms in the country. And I watched another investor decide, in 30 seconds based on nothing, that it wasn't worth his time," Elena told Wallace Tran on the record by name. "That's not diligence. That's ego wearing diligence as a costume." Coastline is proud to be leading this round, and honestly, I think the story tells you everything you need to know about the difference between an investor who's actually doing the work and one who's coasting on a reputation he built a decade ago. The article ran under the headline, "The 30-second pitch that made millions, and the investor who walked away from it." And it did the specific, uncomfortable work that a well-reported piece of business journalism sometimes does. It didn't destroy Preston Calloway, but it made him, for about 6 weeks, a subject of exactly the kind of scrutiny men like him spend careers avoiding. 2 limited partners at his fund, according to industry chatter that reached Daniel secondhand through Renata, asked pointed questions at the next quarterly meeting about deal flow and founder relations. And one of them, a pension fund representative named Howard Liu, who had sat on the fund's advisory board for 6 years, reportedly asked Preston directly, in front of the full room, whether the fund's sourcing process had any structural mechanism at all for catching strong deals that didn't fit a partner's gut instinct in the first 30 seconds, a question Preston did not have a comfortable answer for, and that, according to 2 separate people who were in that room, he answered badly, defensively, in a way that did him no favors. A founders collective that organized several regional demo days quietly stopped inviting him to judge panels, a fact nobody announced publicly, but that Preston, checking his usual calendar of spring events, could not fail to notice. and for the first time in a professional life built almost entirely around the comfort of being the person other people needed something from, he found himself, that spring, in the unfamiliar and uncomfortable position of being the one left off the list. His name, for a stretch of weeks, kept surfacing in comment threads and screenshots whenever the article circulated, always attached to the same phrase, "I've heard enough." Next, a sentence that had taken him perhaps 2 seconds to say, and that followed him, online at least, for a great deal longer than 2 seconds. Daniel did not ask for any of this. He had not, in fact, wanted the story to run as pointedly as it did, and he told Wallace Tran as much when the reporter called for a final follow-up quote before publication. "I don't need the guy to lose his career over 30 seconds, Daniel said. "I need people to know the technology works, and I need Carol Feinberg's 20 units built, and I need, honestly, more than anything, for the next person who walks into a room like that not to get the same treatment I got, because they might not have a rival investor standing at the back of the room that day. That's the story I actually care about." Wallace kept the quote in the final piece, nearly word for word, and it became, in its own quiet way, the article's most quoted line. Preston Calloway read the article the morning it published, sitting in his home office with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not defensiveness, at least not at first, but a kind of slow, uncomfortable recognition. He was 51 years old. His own father had built the investment firm Preston now ran, a man who had made his fortune in commercial real estate in the 80s, and who had raised his son on a steady diet of decisiveness as virtue. "The man who hesitates loses the deal," he used to say, tapping the dinner table for emphasis, and Preston had absorbed that lesson so thoroughly, so early, that he had genuinely come to believe over 3 decades that his ability to render snap judgments quickly was itself a kind of professional excellence, a signal of instinct honed, rather than a habit that occasionally, and sometimes badly, failed the people standing in front of him. He remembered sitting there that morning with the article open on his screen, a specific afternoon from his own childhood, 9 or 10 years old, standing in his father's home office with a science fair project he'd spent 3 weekends building, a small hydraulic elevator model made from wooden dowels and syringes filled with colored water, and his father on the phone with a client had glanced at it for perhaps 4 seconds, said, "Cute, but it'll never hold a reel. Load, you didn't account for friction," and gone back to his call. And Preston, 10 years old, had taken the model apart himself that same evening rather than let it sit as evidence of something not good enough. He had not thought about that afternoon in years, not consciously, but reading his own quote back to himself in cold print. "I'm not being unkind. I'm saving you the runway," he recognized, with a discomfort that took him most of the morning to sit with, that he had spent his entire adult life turning other people's careful work into small hydraulic elevators, taking them apart with a glance before anyone else could tell him whether they'd have held the load. He had, in fact, lost a significant position 2 years earlier on a hardware startup that had looked promising and folded within 18 months, a loss that had embarrassed him privately with his partners, and that he had never fully processed, choosing instead to convert the humiliation into a hardened, unexamined rule. Single-founder hardware plays don't scale, cut them off early, save everyone the time. It was a rule built from one bad outcome, applied indiscriminately ever since, and it had taken a newspaper article with his own quote, "I'm not being unkind. I'm saving you the runway," printed in cold, undeniable text for him to see the shape of what that rule had actually cost, not just to himself, but to however many founders had stood on stages in front of him over the years and never gotten past their first 30 seconds. He did not call Daniel that week. He told himself, the way people often tell themselves, that he needed time to think about how to approach it, and the days stretched into most of a month before he finally, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, picked up the phone. "Mr. Osei," Preston said when Daniel answered, "This is Preston Calloway. I understand if you don't want to talk to me. I wouldn't blame you. I wanted to say something, and I'd rather say it directly than not say it at all." Daniel, standing in his kitchen with Micah doing homework at the table a few feet away, walked into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, and said, evenly, "I'm listening." "What I did at Meridian was wrong," Preston said, and his voice, Daniel noted, didn't have the smoothness it had carried on stage. It was slower, more halting. A man working through something he hadn't fully rehearsed. Not just bad manners. Wrong. "I made a decision about your company, and about you before you'd said more than 2 sentences, based on a bias I built out of one bad deal 2 years ago and never bothered to examine. And I dressed it up as diligence because that felt better than admitting it was just laziness, honestly. Arrogance. I've had a lot of time to sit with that word the last month." He paused. "I read the pilot data Alina's team put together after your round closed. It's genuinely excellent work. Better than most of what crosses my desk with a full technical team behind it. And I keep thinking about the fact that if Alina hadn't been standing at the back of that room, or if your pitch had happened at an event where nobody like her was there to catch it, that technology might just not exist right now, and that's on me. Not the market. Me." Daniel was quiet for a moment, listening to his own son's pencil scratching against paper in the next room, thinking about 11 minutes on a stage, and about how much of that day had actually been about a woman he'd married and lost, and about how little of it, in the end, had ever really been about the man now apologizing to him on the phone. "I appreciate you calling," Daniel said finally. "I mean that. Most people don't." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend that 30 seconds didn't sting. It did. Standing up there and finishing anyway was one of the harder things I've done, and I've done some hard things. But I didn't build this company to get validation from you or anyone else in that room. I built it because 11 minutes was too slow once for someone I loved, and I wasn't going to let anyone's 30 seconds be too slow for me too. So, I hear the apology. I take it seriously. What you do with it from here is what actually matters to me, more than the words themselves." "I've started something," Preston said. "Small, but real. A mentorship track through our fund, specifically for first-time founders from underrepresented backgrounds pitching hardware, the exact kind of company I've been cutting off reflexively for years. I don't expect that to undo anything. I just don't want the next 30 seconds I get to give someone to look like the one I gave you." "That's a good start," Daniel said. "Keep going." He did. Over the following year, Preston's fund funded 3 hardware startups it would almost certainly have passed on 18 months earlier, 2 of them led by first-time black founders. And Preston, though he never became a loud public figure about it, quietly gave a portion of his usual demo day judging slots to newer, less established investors specifically, so his own name would stop being the loudest voice in rooms where founders needed a real hearing rather than a verdict. He never became close with Daniel. The distance between what he'd done and what an apology could actually repair was real, and both men understood that plainly. But Daniel did, 18 months later, receive an unsolicited, unprompted email from him with no ask attached, simply forwarding a local news piece about the assisted living facility's expanded rollout of Anchor Home Systems units, with a single line above it. "Saw this. Wanted you to know I'm still paying attention. Proud of what you built." Daniel read it twice and didn't reply, and didn't need to. Anchor Home Systems grew steadily over the following year. Not explosively, not the kind of overnight hockey stick growth startup mythology likes to sell, but steadily, the way things built on real need tend to grow. 1 assisted living facility becoming 4, then 11, a partnership with 2 regional home health agencies, a second hire, then a third, a modest office space Daniel rented above a hardware store because it was cheap and had good light and was 12 minutes from Micah's school. He hired Renata Okoy's younger cousin, an engineer fresh out of a state university program, as his first full-time technical hire, A small, deliberate gesture of the kind of loyalty that quiet people repay when someone stands beside them in a hallway at exactly the moment it matters. Carol Feinberg's facility became, eventually, a reference site that Coastline Ventures used, with her enthusiastic permission, in pitch materials for 2 subsequent funding rounds. Daniel's mother got one of the very first residential units installed in her own kitchen, insisted on paying for it in full even though Daniel tried 3 separate times to simply give it to her, and called him, 6 weeks after installation, in a voice thick with something between amusement and vindication, to report that the censor had caught her sitting down too fast in her reading chair one evening, and had sent a gentle check-in notification to her phone within 10 seconds, and that she had sat there laughing to herself in the empty apartment, not because anything was wrong, but because for the first time in the 11 years since Daniel's father passed, she had felt, in some small and durable way, less alone in that kitchen than she had in over a decade. "Your father would have liked this thing," she told him. "He always did trust machines more than most people." Daniel had laughed and told her that was probably true, and hung up the phone and sat for a long while in his own kitchen afterward, looking at a D's grocery list on the whiteboard, thinking about how strange and quietly merciful it was that grief, given enough time and enough purpose, could eventually build something that kept other people's mothers safer in their own kitchens too. The company reached a modest, meaningful milestone the following winter. Its 200th unit installed, a number Daniel had once, in the earliest and most uncertain days of the company, considered an almost impossible horizon, and he marked it not with a press release or a party, but by driving out on a cold Saturday to visit Mrs. Ferreira, who was by then something between a pilot participant and an old friend, and who greeted him at her door in a cardigan the color of dried lavender, and told him over tea that her daughter had recently started sleeping through the night again for the first time in 3 years, because she finally believes the box on my wall more than she believes her own worry. And Daniel had driven home that afternoon with the particular hard-won satisfaction of a man who had built something that measured its success not in valuation or headlines, but in other people's uninterrupted sleep. Daniel never told Micah the details of what had happened on that stage, not the specific cruelty of Preston Calloway's 30 seconds, not the newspaper article, not any of it, because 6-year-olds, in Daniel's clear and settled view, did not need to carry the specific weight of the ways the world sometimes underestimated their fathers. But he did, one evening about 4 months after the funding closed, catch Micah watching him work late at the kitchen table on a new sensor calibration. Watts propped on the table beside Micah's own homework the way he always was, and Micah had asked, apropos of nothing, in the direct way small children ask their biggest questions, "Dad, did people think your robot thing was gonna fail?" Daniel set down the sensor he was working on and looked at his son for a moment, considering how much of the truth a 6-year-old could hold. "Some people did, yeah," he said. "One person, actually, thought so pretty loudly. Didn't even give me much of a chance to show him why he was wrong." "What you do?" "I finished S. Howing everybody else anyway," Daniel said. "Didn't yell, didn't argue with him, just kept going because I knew what I'd built was good, even if he didn't want to look at it long enough to see that. And it turned out I was right. Somebody else did really looked, and that's who helped me build all this." He gestured, half-joking, at the small stack of components on the table, at the modest but real company that had grown out of 2 years of nights just like this one. Micah considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Watts says that guy was being a jerk," he announced. "Watts isn't wrong," Daniel said, laughing, and went back to his calibration, and Micah went back to his homework, and the kitchen settled into the particular, ordinary quiet of a small family at the end of an unremarkable evening. No crisis, no drama, just a father and son at a table together. The whiteboard grocery list from a Tuesday 2.5 years earlier still visible on the wall behind them. No longer quite so raw to look at as it once had been, more like a small, steady thread connecting the life Daniel had built now to the one he'd lost, rather than a wound that refused to close. It was nearly a year to the day after Meridian Founders Weekend, on another ordinary Wednesday evening, warm enough that spring had properly arrived, that Daniel sat on the edge of Micah's bed for their nightly routine, Watts tucked under Micah's arm with his one dark, unlit eye catching the lamp light the way it always did. And Micah, freshly 7 now, looked up from his pillow with the specific gravity of a child working up to something he'd clearly been holding on to. "Dad," he said, "are you scared of stuff still? Like grown-up scared, not monster under the bed scared?" Daniel closed the book he'd been reading, marking the page with his thumb, and thought about the question honestly, the way he tried to answer most of Micah's questions. "Yeah, buddy. Grown-ups get scared plenty. I was really scared, actually, right before I showed everybody the robot sensor thing for the first time a while back. Scared it wouldn't work. Scared people wouldn't believe in it. Scared, maybe most of all, that I wasn't gonna be able to finish what me and your mom started thinking about, back before you can even remember." "But you did it anyway," Micah said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I did it anyway," Daniel confirmed. "Being scared and doing the thing anyway, that's most of what being brave actually is, you know. It's not about not being scared. Anybody who tells you that's lying to you a little. It's about not letting the scared part be the only thing steering." He reached over and smoothed Micah's hair back from his forehead, an old, unconscious habit by now. "Somebody was pretty mean to me once, right before I did the scariest part of all this. Told me pretty much that what I'd built wasn't worth his time, and for about 10 seconds I almost believed him." "But you didn't," Micah said, with total certainty, the certainty only a child fully convinced of his father's strength could produce. "No," Daniel agreed. "I didn't. Because I knew something he didn't bother finding out. I knew exactly why I was building it and exactly who it was for, and no 30 seconds from somebody who wasn't willing to actually look was ever gonna be bigger than that. You understand?" Micah nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was turning something over that was a little bigger than his years but not entirely out of reach. And then, because he was 7, and because the conversation had run its natural course, he pulled Watts a little closer against his chest and said, through a yawn already tugging him toward sleep, "I think you're the bravest dad I know. Even braver than Watts." "That," Daniel said, laughing quietly, "is very high praise coming from Watts's biggest fan." And he leaned down and kissed the top of his son's head, and turned the lamp down low but not off, the way Micah still liked it, and sat there a moment longer in the near dark, listening to his son's breathing settle into the slow, even rhythm of easy sleep, thinking about a whiteboard grocery list and a stage with a countdown clock, and 11 minutes he had refused to let anyone take from him, and feeling, for the first time in longer than he could easily measure, something that was not quite peace, exactly, but was close enough to it that he had stopped waiting for it to arrive as something bigger. Then he stood, pulled the door most of the way shut behind him, the way Micah preferred, and paused in the hallway outside for a moment, the way he sometimes still did, listening to the particular quiet of a house with a child safely asleep inside it. Passing the kitchen, he glanced at the whiteboard on the wall, the grocery list in a D's handwriting still there after all this time, milk, the good bread, asked Daniel about the smoke detector batteries, a small, ordinary fragment of a Tuesday that had never gotten the chance to become anything more than a fragment, and he stood there a moment, not sad exactly, not anymore, just present with it, the way you might stand for a moment at the edge of water you've long since learned to swim in. He thought about the version of himself who had sat in that coffee shop on Kessler Street 6 weeks before the pitch, staring at an acceptance email he could barely trust was real. He thought about 11 minutes on a stage, and a man in a gray quarter zip who had needed only 30 seconds to decide who Daniel was, and how wrong that man had been, not maliciously wrong, not even, in the end, permanently wrong, but wrong in the particular, correctable way that comes from mistaking speed for wisdom. He thought about Mrs. Ferreira's kitchen, and his own mother's kitchen, 200 kitchens and counting now, each one a little safer than it had been the year before, each one holding some version of the same quiet promise he had built the whole company around, that nobody should have to wait 11 minutes for someone to notice they needed help. He walked back down the hallway toward the rest of an ordinary evening in a small, steady life that he had built, almost entirely alone, out of grief and stubbornness, and 11 minutes he had refused to shorten for anyone, and went into his own bedroom, and did not turn on the light, and lay down in the dark the way he did most nights, and let the ordinary, hard-won peace of the evening settle over him the way it did now, more nights than not. In a way it hadn't for a long time after Adiz died, and somewhere in the building around him, a pipe settled and a car passed outside and his son slept 2 rooms away with a small broken robot tucked under one arm. And Daniel Osei, 39 years old, single father, engineer, founder of a company built out of grief turned into purpose, closed his eyes and slept. Thank you so much for watching all the way to this moment. If this story moved you even a little, please take a second to like the video. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Daniel and Micah's. And down in the comments, I'd love to know which moment hit you hardest.